Well, I mean, when you ask me about like the attack in the U.S. over the holidays, you're gonna have to be more specific. I mean, are you talking about the attack a couple of days before Christmas when a woman was set on fire on the New York subway? Is that what you're talking about, or you're talking about the guy who got pushed in front of the train, the subway train, on New Year's Eve day? Is that what you're talking about, or you're talking about the mass shooting on New Year's Eve in Illinois, or the shooting in Mississippi, or the shooting in Ohio, or the shooting in Chicago, or you're talking about the mass shooting in New York on New Year's Eve, or is it the guy who drove his car into a crowd in New Orleans, or is it the Tesla truck that blew up in Las Vegas? Which one are you talking about? I'm going to need to know which one of these acts of wanton violence, which one of these acts of wanton violence is the one that interests you? Which one of these bothers you? I mean, I can guess. But for anyone who genuinely condemns violence, who genuinely detests, and who genuinely does condemn indiscriminate violence against innocent people, well, then you're going to have to explain to me the selectivity of your horror. Because you don't look like a people actually that's horrified by violence, frankly. I mean, that woman who was set on fire on the subway, your people were just filming it. The man who set her on fire, in fact, was just sitting on a bench watching her burn to death. People just walking past. Security people just walking past. It was the same nonchalance with which you have shrugged off the tens of thousands of innocent children, women, and men murdered on an industrial scale in Gaza. It's the same nonchalance, the same blasé attitude. So yes, it's a bit confusing. How exactly you choose which acts of depraved violence you decide are actually bad and are actually alarming? Of course, we all know that you have said that the man who rammed his car into a crowd of people on Bourbon Street in New Orleans, you've all said, you've claimed that he pledged allegiance to ISIS. We haven't seen any evidence of that yet, as far as I know. We haven't seen any evidence of that except for an ISIS flag that was mounted upside down. And we've seen pictures where the flag is there and the flag isn't there, pictures of his truck. You said that there's videos of him on social media talking about joining ISIS, talking about believing in ISIS and what have you, but no one has seen those videos. What we know is that he was born and bred in America, just like almost everyone else who commits violent crimes in your country. Just like the gunman in the 500 mass shootings in America last year, the 40 school shootings in America last year. We know that he was a veteran of your military. You trained him, you created him, your society indoctrinated him, and then your military indoctrinated him. Turns out the same is true with the Tesla bomber. That was also your guy. Another American soldier, an active duty Green Beret, no less. I saw some U.S. senator, Randy Fine, tweeting something about how we have to do something about these violent Muslims, how Islam is this fundamentally broken and dangerous culture and we need to do something about it. That's Senator Randy Fine. He's from Florida. Okay. You had nearly 1,200 murders in Florida, Randy Fine, in 2024. That's over 7 per 100,000 people. Let's compare that to a somewhat comparable Muslim country, say Tunisia. Well, the homicide rate in Tunisia is 2 per 100,000. So Florida is nearly 4 times more violent than Tunisia. Okay, Tunisia has a small population, smaller than Florida. So what about Turkey? Turkey has a much larger population than Florida. It's easily as developed, if not more developed, and has bigger cities than Florida. So what about Turkey? Well, that's 3 per 100,000. So Senator Fine's state is more than twice as violent as Turkey, which is about 4 times larger than Florida in terms of population. Okay, let's say Malaysia then. Florida is about 23 million people. Malaysia is about 34 million. So 10 million or so more. Similar climate, similar level of development. Okay, again, Florida's homicide rate is 7 per 100,000, 7.4 per 100,000. Malaysia has a homicide rate of 0.7 per 100,000. So Senator Fine's state is over 7 times more violent than Malaysia. Homicide rates in the UAE, homicide rates in Saudi Arabia are similar to this. Florida has a higher homicide rate than Afghanistan. It has a higher homicide rate than Syria. Imagine that. You're safer in Syria than you are in Florida. In fact, the only Muslim countries that have a higher rate of homicide than Florida are Muslim countries where Muslims are being killed by Americans or their proxies. And yes, their proxies include groups like ISIS. So when you say that your American veteran joined ISIS, well, we in the Muslim world just regard that as more or less being the same as when a U.S. veteran leaves the army and goes to join a private military contractor. ISIS is nothing but America's Wagner. Everybody knows that around the world. That's why you sent your Ukrainians to go work with them in the Sahel. That's why they're guarding Syria's oil facilities for you. ISIS works for you. We know that. I mean, I'm sorry, but after the last 24 years, we've all reached the point of regarding the official, at face value explanation for terrorist attacks as simply being a possible, if usually implausible version of what happened. So, okay, you say a U.S. Army veteran somehow became radicalized and he was somehow inspired by ISIS to drive his truck into a crowd of people on Bourbon Street in New Orleans on New Year's Eve and then open fire on the police. Okay, maybe it happened like that. We don't know. But you all created this skepticism by your non-stop lying and manipulation and by never actually ever demonstrating to the people that you are above sacrificing them, sacrificing your own citizens for political and economic gain, for political agendas. And because, as I've said, as I've been talking about, you have never, ever demonstrated that you care even slightly about the lives and the safety of your own citizens, not even a little bit. Your cities are more dangerous than war zones in the rest of the world, and that's a fact. It's abnormal. It's unnatural. The extent of the psychopathy of your government, of your authorities, of your whole society. And you know, I'm not saying that the New Orleans attacker might not have been radicalized. He might not have genuinely pledged allegiance to ISIS. I don't know. It's not unbelievable. It could have happened. But I mean, who radicalized the rest of you then? Because look, before Christmas, you had a similar attack in Germany, right? You all thought it was a Muslim. But it turns out it was just one of those crazed ex-Muslims, an apostate atheist who was a full-on believer in your so-called Western values, your so-called enlightenment and so forth, your secularism. I mean, that's why you gave him asylum. Because he was on your side. He was completely subscribed to your outlandish, dishonest propaganda about Islam. And he hated Muslims. Oh, yes, he did. He hated Muslims. Okay, ex-Muslims and extremist Muslims actually have a lot in common. Truth is, both of them are westernized. Both of them are ignorant about Islam. Both of them reject Islamic teachings. They reject genuine Islamic teachings. Both of them are basically miseducated about Islam by you. They both believe what you tell them about Islam, which makes them more or less products of Western society. The ex-Muslim believes that Islam is savage and violent because you told him it is. And so then they hate Islam savagely and violently, just like you. The extremists also believe that Islam is savage and violent because you told them that it is. And so then they act savagely and they act violently according to your teachings. And more often than not, they act savagely and they act violently against who? Against other Muslims, just like you. Same as what you do. Everybody in the world knows who the problem is. Everyone in the world knows who's the most violent society on earth. Everyone knows the most violent culture on earth. Everyone knows who are the most vicious terrorists on earth. And it most certainly isn't the 2 billion Muslims of the world who collectively have the lowest rate of violent crime in the world and who are collectively the most victimized by Western violence. And I'm very sorry to tell you, but an American driving a car into a crowd of Americans in America doesn't change that reality. So you want us to condemn it? Well, of course we condemn it. We condemn all of your violence, whether you call it terrorism or you call it crime, whether you act alarmed about it or you act nonchalant about it. You treat it as mundane. It's all horrific and repugnant to us. It's all alarming to us. It's alarming to any civilized person who comes from a civilized society, where people don't act like that. And like I said, no one outside of your society, outside of your strange culture, no one understands how or why you apply different definitions, different characterizations for your acts of brutality. Like, remember the guy who blew up his van in Nashville in 2020? You remember that? Somehow you just swept that under the rug, like it was nothing. You said that it wasn't terrorism. The man blew up his van outside of the AT&T building, shut down the internet in Nashville, and you said that he chose his time and place for maximum impact. That's what you said. That's what the FBI said. But then you also said it was just a suicide, not terrorism. Okay, why? You know, after that woman was burned to death in New York on the subway in New York, they caught guys a few days later trying to get on the train, trying to get on the subway with lit Molotov cocktails. That's also not terrorism. You have an elite, highly trained American soldier blow up his truck in Las Vegas in front of a hotel that's owned by the incoming president of the United States. But this is not terrorism. You had a mob of people with clear political demands set fire to a police station in Portland, Oregon, not terrorism. But you bomb hospitals, you bomb schools, you bomb ambulances, you even bomb United Nations staff. And not only is that not terrorism, but in fact, you say that the victims of your bombs are terrorists. See, this kind of nonsensical, cynical approach to violence is absolutely sadistic to the cognition of your own people. I mean, to people outside of your society, it's just blatant lack of seriousness about violence. In other words, to everyone outside the West, we all understand that you never mean it. You never mean it at all when you pretend to be horrified or you pretend to be outraged by violence, no matter who commits it. You don't care. I don't think that you cared about any victim of violence in 2024 in your country, except for that United Healthcare CEO. That's maybe the only homicide victim that you actually cared about. But you don't care about the victims in New Orleans, just like you don't care about the victims in Chicago. You don't care about the victims in New York. You don't care about the victims in Ohio or Mississippi or Gaza. Your music is violent. Your movies are violent. Your TV shows are violent. Your games are violent. Your children's stories are violent. And your policies are violent, and your society is violent, and you don't take any of that seriously. Well, that means that you live in a society, you live in a culture that does not value life, that doesn't value your life. And you have authorities, and you have officials, leaders, and politicians, and so forth. You have a government that does not care about you at all. They don't care about your life. They don't care about your life any more than they care about the people overseas who they bomb and kill every day. Your life is only valuable to them, or rather your death is only valuable to them as a vehicle for justifying repression on the pretext of security or some other political agenda. So, for instance, 500 mass shootings in 2024, rampant violent crime, people being burned alive on the subway, none of that, according to your government, constitutes a threat to your safety. None of that extreme violence is alarming in any way. None of it needs any sort of a response. But the attacks in New Orleans, because allegedly there was an ISIS flag connected to it, that somehow is incredibly dangerous. I mean, aren't you tired? Aren't you tired of living in a society that holds you in such contempt? Look, they don't just insult your intelligence, they literally don't value your life. Your government, your elites have turned your society into a death cult, and they're cannibalizing you. Even your children aren't safe. There's no one more dangerous than these people. No one poses a greater threat to you and to everyone else than those people, than your elites, your authorities, your officials, your politicians. They'll tell you that the Muslims are the danger. Muslims are the danger. When Muslims have a fraction of your society's level of violence in our societies. Well, it looks to me like they really think that what's dangerous is actually peace itself. It looks like the thing that they fear the most is real security, real stability, real harmony, real safety, the kind of security and stability and harmony and safety that we have in the Muslim world. Or anyway, the safety that we have in the Muslim world until you invade, until you come over and you attack and you occupy our countries. We're perfectly fine and safe until you show up. Maybe that's what you mean, actually, by spreading your values, spreading your way of life. What you actually mean is to turn our countries into the dystopian war zones that your society is. And maybe that's what you mean also about Muslim immigration potentially endangering your culture, endangering your way of life, because it might actually civilize your society at some point. Maybe you're afraid that if you get enough Muslims in your country, then your homicide rate might actually drop to a fraction of what it is now. And who knows? If people in America, if people in the West were actually secure in their lives, and they didn't have to worry about getting shot or set on fire every time they walk out the house or they send their kids to school, if they were actually safe and secure, well, maybe they'd be able to start concentrating on educating themselves about the world and about policy. And maybe they'd start trying to hold their politicians and their oligarchs accountable. And maybe they would actually try to build a society, and they'd have the time and the safety and the security to build a society on justice and economic fairness. You know, come to think of it, I can actually see exactly why Muslims are so scary to your power structure.